Video games have been around longer than I've been alive. They open a world of possibilities, literally. One minute you're playing a hardcore racing sim, the next you're jumping on boxes as a bandicoot. You play games, watch movies, even surf online stores, and while that's impressive in itself, what's more impressive are the input devices that let you do it. This is the PlayStation controller, the original, pre-analog, pre-rumble, pre-touchpad. This was literally an SNES controller with extra shoulder buttons. This was meant to be the input device for hundreds of genres, thousands of games, and even play music CDs. And while other consoles have had controller iterations, the Sony PlayStation is the one system that never went too far from the original design. To understand how we got from this to this, you'll have to go on a journey of ingenious design, impossible engineering, and failed experiments. Technically speaking, the very first PlayStation controller was the ill-fated Nintendo PlayStation prototype. And if you overlay that original design to what we eventually got, you can kind of see the striking similarities. Designated SCP-H1010, Teo Goto was the designer of the original 1994 controller. His goal was to create a controller very similar to what we got on the Super Nintendo, saying the Super NES was a huge hit at the time. The management department didn't want the controller to be a radical departure. It had to be a standard type of design or gamers wouldn't accept it. The shoulder buttons were a design that the analog sticks would eventually take over, meaning the L2 and R2 were built to help navigate a 3D world. Since Sony pushed hard for 3D games, this would help you navigate those worlds while leaving the face buttons to traditional gameplay. The grips were also added to help with holding the controller, and thankfully stop those hand cramps most gamers my age are all too familiar with. Even the button iconography had meaning to them. The circle stood for yes, while the cross meant no, something reversed in the United States. The triangle was meant to represent a point of view, and the square, which looked like a document or paper, was meant to represent a menu. This was followed up by the SCP-H1080, released in 1996, 10% larger, had a longer cord, and used a ferrite ring to suppress high-frequency electronic noise and to stop any potential crashes or corruption to your memory card. This was also the first controller we received in the States when first opening that PlayStation box and introduced a whole new generation of gamers to a universe of 3D polygon worlds. Now, while you would think this was the next controller, there was sort of a release prototype that, depending on your region, may have been severely crippled in features. Designated SCP-H1180, the dual analog controller was Sony's first foray into the analog design with the iconic analog sticks. Released in 1997, it coincided with the release of Tobal 2 and Bushido Blades, some of the first analog-capable games. If you were in Japan, the controller had rumble features. However, rumble was taken out for the US release. Multiple speculations from Nintendo trying to block Sony, to Sony stating gamers would rather have analog instead of rumble, something that will echo later in the PlayStation's life. With 3 modes of operation, the controller could perform in digital-only, traditional analog mode, and analog flight stick mode, which emulated the PlayStation analog joystick. Sadly, this feature was only seen on the analog controller and was not carried over into the DualShock or DualSense line. The design of the controller was also something we would never really see again. The R2 and L2 buttons had ridges and were wider, the grips were longer, and the analog sticks were concave and made of smooth plastic. The analog button stuck out, and while the controller was compatible with the PlayStation 2, the rumble mechanic did not work on that system. The controller wasn't long for this world. With multiple design changes and features missing in certain regions, the Japanese market said the controller was too large as the grips were 0.59 inches longer, and the North American market wanted rumble. Because of this, the controller was quickly discontinued in 1998. With this arguably failed design came a phoenix rising from its ashes. Designated SCP-H1200, the DualShock is the basis of the modern day controller. While not completely copied, Sony laid the foundation of every major console manufacturer's controller design. Like the original controller, the internals were designed for immersion while staying within the form factor of that original foundation. The Rumble was built around two motors, with the left one being larger than the right. It also didn't rely on batteries like the N64 Rumble Pack, instead utilizing the controller's core to siphon power from the console itself. With a form factor that matches the original design, rubber grips, and smarter shoulder buttons, the controller was an instant hit. After this revision, most if not all controllers will utilize a dual analog stick layout, minus one very stubborn console manufacturer. Capcom even re-released the smash hit Resident Evil and Resident Evil 2 with analog stick support. This was truly the first steps into modern day gaming. The layout wasn't by chance either. The analog sticks were placed so when you hold the controller, the sticks don't get in the way of the digital buttons. And while we take stick placement for granted, back in the 90s, this was a new frontier. Yes, we had joystick-based controllers and even dual-stick controllers in the arcades and simulation scene, but this form factor and how one stick became the de facto movement in the other, camera control, was something other console manufacturers didn't yet grasp. We tend to forget the camera controls in Mario 64 were exclusively handled by the C buttons, and going back to games like GoldenEye feels off or old because of the limitations of that controller. Even the Sega Dreamcast only utilized one stick. It would take another 4 years with the release of the GameCube controller to actually see a major console manufacturer use a dual stick design. While Nintendo can be credited as the father of modern digital controller design, Sony was the father of analog controller design. Dual sticks, dual motors, and a quad shoulder button layout, the DualShock was, and forever will be, the blueprint of modern controller design. In 2000, with the release of the PS1, a smaller iteration of the console, came the SCPH110, with a lighter color, purplish gray tones, and a more rounded connector to match the console's industrial design. While the PlayStation was a smash hit, the console became an ultra seller with the release of the PlayStation 2, requiring the controller to play double duty, allowing the user to interface with the game, but also as a wired remote for Multimedia Center, as this was the first console to have DVD support native. And while Sony never had a centralized online hub, games started going online, requiring you to use the controller more like a mouse, inputting text, selecting options, and navigating more and more complicated menus. While the design is almost identical to the DualShock 2 or SCPH10010 sported stiffer sticks, a visual color change to match the consoles, and was slightly lighter in weight. However, a lesser known feature included pressure-sensitive buttons, allowing games like racing titles to control the car's speed more accurately. The DualShock and DualShock 2 are backwards compatible and forwards compatible up to the PlayStation 3, allowing you to carry over that first analog stick to what I would consider the modern HD console era. With the release of the PlayStation 3 in 2006, Sony was riding off the popularity of the PlayStation 2, but with a bumpy start and a less than stellar showing of the prototype controller, the legacy of the DualShock was in limbo, and with the release of the new controller, saw the death of the DualShock brand altogether.
No one ever sees me, I'm losing every battle. No one ever sees me, I'm losing every battle. No one ever sees me, I'm losing every battle. Can somebody save me, I'm losing every battle.
Introducing the Sixaxis controller, a motion controller that sensed rotational orientation and translational acceleration within a three-dimensional axis. It's a motion controller. That's all it is, a motion controller. And it was a disaster day one for Sony. Due to a lawsuit with Immersion on the patents involving rumble motors, Sony could not release a DualShock successor. However, this was not Sony's reasoning at first, saying the motors would interfere with the motion controller, which is exactly the excuse they used with the dual analog controller. Sony, for some reason, didn't want to mention the lawsuit and went full into the idea that Rumble was last gen, and this upset everybody. While the motion mechanics were a big part of the controller, the analog sticks were more sensitive than the DualShock 2, and for the first time, first-party controllers were wireless, in addition to a new home button which was similar to the iPhone home button. While the DualShock 2 needed to play dual roles, the Sixaxis needed to play a multitude of roles. The controller wasn't just used to play games, it controlled Blu-ray movie playback, video streaming services, online stores, MMOs, interface navigation, photo editing, and even allowing it to be used on a Mac. New roles, new tech, new buttons, but the same form factor. This controller was very different from the DualShock of the past. The wireless connection wasn't proprietary like Microsoft's Xbox 360 was. It used the Bluetooth standard to connect but did not include a discovery mode, so it could not traditionally be connected to a Bluetooth device and required to be wired with a PS3 to pair. Surprisingly, the controller was actually compatible with Apple computers and Linux computers of that time. However, the charging technology was not smart, so it couldn't be charged via USB to wall brick like an iPhone. It needed the PS3 to get the charging power. Powering the controller was a 3.7 lithium battery which provided up to 30 hours of life. While not initially stated if the battery was user accessible, it was later found to be very easy to replace the battery, which thank God, because these are like all but dead right now. The USB mini connector was used to charge and for data, so even if the battery was dead, once connected, the controller would act like a normal wire controller. The controller also had indicator lights labeled 1, 2, 3, and 4 to show which player you are. The console could read up to 7 controllers, and to showcase this, the LEDs would sum up the 7. So if you're player 5, 1, and 4 would light up. Why 7? This was strictly a limitation of the Bluetooth standard of the time, which only allowed up to 7 connections to 1 hub. Might be wrong about this. Sony also had plans to use the PlayStation Eye and the LED lights to track the controllers. While never used, it was integrated into the PlayStation 4 and the Move controllers. Much like the analog controllers, users were less than favorable about the lack of vibration, and while packed with new technology in the same form factor, the controller felt cheap because of how light it was. But in just a year's time, this was all about to change. Designated SCPH-98050, the DualShock 3 was the Sixaxis and more. Bringing back haptic feedback by settling the patent infringement lawsuit with Immersion, Sony resurrected the DualShock branding. In 2008, the Sixaxis controller was discontinued and the DualShock 3 became the default controller of the PlayStation 3. Up until this point, the PlayStation line of controllers have had very little cosmetic changes. Internally, it was a different story, but with the amount of technology that was packed into the controller, it was only a matter of time before things changed. The PlayStation 4 was released in 2013 to much fanfare, a total reversal of the PlayStation 3 launch. Sony was back, and with that change came CUH-ZCT-1 or the DualShock 4, and a drastic redesign to the original controller. Sporting a new 2-point capacitive touchpad that also doubled as a giant button, it contained motion detection via 3-axis gyroscope and 3-axis accelerometer with, of course, vibration. One of the most noticeable additions was a light bar that held 3 LEDs that changed color to help identify players. It was also used for in-game immersion and matched the colors of the face buttons, so you had blue, pink, green, and red. The lights also worked with the PlayStation camera to judge position and movement, as it was originally developed for PlayStation VR. Again, might be wrong about that. With the move towards online play, the controller featured multiple ports, including a 3.5mm stereo headphone jack, a micro USB port, and an extension port. Besides the light bar and touchpad, the controller also featured a small speaker between the analog sticks. This was also the first time the start and select buttons were not included on the controller. Instead, a share and option button took their place, and because of the touch bar and speakers, they were moved closer to the D-pad and face buttons. While the option button played dual roles as the start and select, the share button was an all-new dedicated action that allowed you to upload screenshots and video of your gameplay. The analog sticks were even redesigned and brought back the convex style of the analog controller, but with the rubberized caps. It also utilized pressure-sensitive L2 and R2 triggers, and is backwards compatible with the PlayStation 3. The DualShock 4 was a total redesign of the last iconic hardware of the PlayStation brand. While the placement for most of the buttons were the same, this was a drastic redesign that would never go back to that original design, minus the ill-fated PlayStation Mini console. In 2016, the revision of the DualShock 4 was released, designated CUHZCT2, which had better USB communication, a longer battery life, and an opening on the top of the touchpad to see what color light is illuminating. This leads us up to today, but before we move forward, let's look back. Back to a legacy, a history, a defining moment in gaming that all started with a rebranded version of the Super Nintendo controller.
I know I'm acting stupid, but being dumb, maybe just a little bit foolish, but I feel so young. Drunk, I've never seen you clearer than now. We're flying high, floating somewhere up in the clouds. We're going out of ourselves, can you feel it? Almost like I don't know if it's real, cause when we're doing our thing, we're like wheels that won't stop turning. So take me on a trip, now, trip. Oh, flick that switch, kill the lights. Oh, wasted. City lights are shining so bright. All these empty faces, we don't care about them tonight. We're going out of ourselves, can you feel it? Almost like I don't know if it's real, cause when we're doing our thing, we're the wheels that won't stop turning. I know we're acting stupid, we're being dumb, maybe just a little bit foolish, but I feel so young. Just go a little crazy and lose it. I don't care if we're dumb, it's the only way we know how to do it. You make me feel so young. Oh.
In 2020, and at the time of filming this video, a major pandemic has ravaged the globe, but this didn't stop Sony in revealing the next generation of the PlayStation console. And the first thing they showed off? The next generation of controller design and technology. An even more redesigned controller that no longer resembles any of the traditional Sony controllers, and once again, sunsetting the DualShock name. Only this time the controller was done right. The DualSense controller sports a two-tone design. Gone are the iconic colors of the face buttons and replaced with clear face buttons with a similar D-pad. The grips were redesigned to be more ergonomic, and the light bar was even more integrated into the controller in an almost organic design. The share button has been replaced with the create feature, which allows you to create content within the system and share your images and video. The controller introduced voice coil actuators, which provided haptic feedback similar to the Switch's HD Rumble. It also sports a new controversial microphone array, in addition to analog triggers with force feedback and old familiars like a 3.5 headphone jack, but with a new USB-C connection for power. But it wouldn't be Sony without a little controversy. Just a little. Currently, Sony has been subject to a class action lawsuit due to a drift issue with the analog sticks. Much like Nintendo, these $70 controllers probably shouldn't have these issues, but here we go. While you could still see the similarities with the PS4 controller, the DualSense looks and feels more like Microsoft's own controllers. However, they still have that original placement of buttons and iconography, something Teo Goto spoke about all those years ago. The foundation of this original controller is still present in the DualSense, a legacy that will hopefully not be forgotten. One can only imagine what's next for Sony. If there will ever be a new console, will this controller be the new legacy, or will we get something totally different? With the recent reveal of the new VR controllers, are these a teaser of the next generation of controllers? In a way, Nintendo has done this with the new split design controllers. We saw this with the PlayStation Move controllers, and it seems this is the de facto design for all VR controllers moving forward. Will the PlayStation 6 controllers be split? Will it be the VR controllers? Only time will tell. Hey, thanks for watching. If you like this video, make sure to subscribe for more because I'm working on a killer new video that hopefully will top this one. Well, time's up, and hopefully you learned something about design, Sony, or gaming in general. And until then, I'll see you next time.